CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. And boy, is there a lot going on out there with the legislative session ending, the government kind of under fire on a bunch of different topics. We want to break it all down for you this week, but thank you so much for joining us, watching us on CHEK TV, on the CHEK Plus app, on YouTube, or listening to us on wherever you get your podcasts. All the old episodes of the show are on there as well on CHEK Plus if you want to check us out and get up to speed on everything we've been talking about last week's show, breaking down the Royal BC Museum controversy. That was very interesting, worth you checking out if you missed it. Let's bring in the panel this week. It's going to break everything down. Jillian Oliver, BC Green strategist extraordinaire, is here as she is every week. Katy Merrifield, Vice President of Wellington Advocacy, is here, and Jeff Ferrier usually joins us. He is off this week. So we're going to jump right in to, I think, one of the biggest announcements we've had in BC politics in a while now, a historic announcement that Ottawa has approved BC's request for decriminalization of personal possession of small amounts of illicit substances. So we're talking cocaine, heroin, MDMA, methamphetamines. If you're below a certain amount, you won't be charged or arrested, or police won't seize your drugs. The idea here, according to the BC government, reduce the stigma around this. If you're not facing the potential to be arrested or charged, you might be more willing to be open to treatment or talking about your drug-related issues and addictions issues. It is the first Canadian province to have gone this route, so everyone is kind of watching here. What do we make of the decision, BC's position on this, and what it all means? Jillian, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think the government deserves a lot of credit for showing leadership on this. That's kind of like the main point, is to show really high level leadership at the top that this is a health crisis. It's not, an issue of criminality, and that's how it should be treated. And the idea is that sort of, eventually, filters down into treatment. It helps, sends a big signal to healthcare professionals about how they should be treating people struggling with these issues, and sort of is like an important foundational piece to shifting the way that we treat overdoses and addictions. The devil is in the details, like it always is. The province had asked for a higher amount to be decriminalized, and the federal government essentially cut that in half. What the province had put forward was already done in consultation with advocates, with people who use drugs and who advocate on the issue, as well as with police. So it was already a compromise. And I think it was a little bit disappointing to see Ottawa come in and sort of, put its thumb on the scales on the issue. And there's also a long delay in implementation. It's a crisis. People are dying every day, and this doesn't come in until January. So, some disappointing details, but all in all, an important step towards treating it like a health crisis.
Yeah, there are good points there, because this is a watered down version of BC's original request. Ottawa, like you mentioned, changed those details, decided it didn't agree with the kind of, I think, the core numbers in BC's submission, and instituted its own, and then kind of forced them on the government. So that's an interesting dynamic. But Katy, this is supposed to fit into a much larger, broader discussion about addictions, everything from safe supply to treatment. Decriminalization fits in there. That discussion of the spectrum here. What do you make of adding this into the mix?
Yeah, so I'd say this was appropriately watered down, but we can get into that later. I agree with the motive in that we should be moving drug use and addiction into the healthcare space where it belongs. But there are several problems with this announcement. Because I think what's key when you move forward with decriminalization, you should also have an adequate treatment system for it to be successful. And we don't have that here. If we look at a few examples globally where decriminalization has happened, let's talk about opioid substitution therapy. So in Switzerland, where it's decriminalized, almost 70% of heroin addicts there are on opioid substitution therapy, which is the highest ratio in the world. In BC, we have approximately 88,000 people who are opioid dependent, and less than 1/3 of those folks are able to access opioid substitution treatment due to cost or accessibility. In terms of treatment infrastructure, in Portugal, which I will remind folks is the gold standard, they have a committee on drug dissuasion that recommends users everything like services like counseling to residential treatment. The drugs are confiscated, and police have a really defined role in all of this. And in BC, we lack that infrastructure. And then in terms of results, like let's take a look somewhere closer to home. In Oregon in 2020, they moved via a public referendum to decriminalize drugs for personal possession. And since then, fentanyl-laced drugs have resulted in a 20% increase in hospitalizations, and drug overdoses have doubled. So given our drug supply here in BC is overwhelmingly cut with fentanyl and its analogs, not to mention benzodiazepines, I think we're on the same track to experience what Oregon did without the appropriate treatment infrastructure in place.
So, Katy, we've talked about treatment in the past and the fact the government doesn't really seem to know what it should be doing there. It keeps adding random beds. We don't know how many beds are needed. There's gaps all over the place. Is it a solvable issue, treatment, from your mind? Is there something government should be doing? Are there other things that should have happened before decriminalization, or what should they do now?
Yeah, I think it should have happened in tandem. And there are other jurisdictions that are embracing innovations that I think we should look at here at home over the next 7 months. Like in Alberta, they removed any user costs to publicly funded residential treatment. If you are in distress, you can go to any fire station in Edmonton, and they will immediately connect you with virtual opioid dependency clinics. Like these are the kinds of initiatives that we need to see. They announced 4,000 spaces at the beginning of our mandate, whereas in BC we get press releases that, oh, there's 5 beds opening up in this region, as if that is something to celebrate. Like it needs to be better. We need to address this in a very comprehensive way. And I just don't think that pushing half measures does the trick. And, I want to cite a quote from David Eby back in 2009 when he was the head of the BC Civil Liberties Association. He said, "If you want to spend your entire welfare check on crack, that is your right. It is our moral obligation to offer folks a way out of it, but they have the right to make that stupid decision." So I kind of agree with Mr. Eby on the moral obligation to help addicts or help drug users with a way out. And I don't see that happening. And I think it's also really telling that not a single premier in Canada outside of British Columbia has indicated that they are going to follow suit with this announcement. I think everyone is going to be adopting a wait and see attitude to see if we move towards a more successful Switzerland style model or if we end up like Oregon.
Jillian, that federal dynamic and the other premiers, as Katy mentioned there, A, we have Ottawa watering down BC's proposal. B, it was announced the day before there was a vote set for NDP MP Gord John's bill to make decriminalization national that the federal Liberals wanted to oppose. And it felt like maybe they were using BC for a bit of cover, coming out in favor of decrim over here, but then voting against it the next day. The dynamic federally about this is how much of that is in play here. And as Katy mentioned, the other premiers don't seem enthusiastic about this. Could that have influenced Ottawa's kind of tepid enthusiasm on this as well?
Definitely. And I think, attitudes in other provinces are really different from BC, where we've kind of been ground zero for this crisis. And we've also seen, other past political leaders, take bolder steps to sort of change the conversation, like Merrifield in Vancouver, who implemented safe injection sites against the wishes of the federal government and then had to fight the government in court. That's an example of, a smaller level of government just saying, we don't want to get involved in federal politics. We want to just plow ahead because it's the right thing to do. But there's a huge cost to that. They were, that really absorbed a lot of the city of Vancouver's resources and attention for a long time, fighting the federal government on those issues. So it makes sense why a provincial government would want to sort of, go a little bit slower, try to get Ottawa's buy-in, and do it in a little bit of a less controversial way, especially on an issue like this. But on the other hand, you kind of see how it has the potential to sort of stymie progress in other provinces where, for political reasons, there aren't as many provincial and local leaders willing to sort of take a bolder stance on it.
Yeah, it felt to me like this was the least the federal government could have done, given that the Prime Minister in the election kind of promised to take this request seriously and help BC out, and couldn't flat out reject it. So instead, they came back with a much smaller threshold, a 3-year pilot project instead of making it permanent. And if we have an election provincially or federally, and we will in the next 3 years, this whole pilot project could disappear. And then waiting 7 months, the provincial government is going to get hammered every single month between now and then for continued record overdose deaths. They're not going to be able to point to decrim until January of next year. So it's, in some ways, yes, a historic announcement, but in other ways, it fell short, I think, of what BC government officials wanted. And I think they also felt they got jammed by Ottawa in more ways than one on the announcement and the details of this. So we'll keep an eye on that.
Can I ask
Katy,
one more question?
You want to jump in? Yeah.
Why should that amount be higher? So I spent this morning just looking at other jurisdictions that have decriminalized hard drugs, and I go back to Portugal. Their restrictions are 1 gram for heroin, 2 for cocaine. Peru is 2 for cocaine. Mexico, you can carry up to 0.5 gram with no penalty. 4.5. Where is that coming from? Like Minister Bennett said, she used stats from law enforcement indicating that 85% of drug seizures are under 2.5 grams. So I'm wondering why anyone would think that it would be a good idea to take a unprecedented step of having such a high number, 4.5 grams, when that it hasn't been tested here, and we lack appropriate treatment infrastructure.
Well, in the BC's proposal, there was a 19-group roundtable that, including user groups, that said, here's the average amount that is used based on the type of drug, and here's the average amount daily. And they felt that it should be even higher than 4.5 grams, but that certainly wasn't something Ottawa seemed comfortable with. And so BC's position, I think, as Jillian said, was already a compromise at 4.5. User groups wanted more, police wanted less. The government found that middle ground, and then Ottawa said, no, we'll go with the amount that the police chiefs want. And the argument being, in rural and remote communities, for example, it's harder to access illicit substances, so you're going to have to buy more often to feed your addiction, and that will lead to more dangerous interactions and potentially purchasing contaminated drugs. I think you bring up an open debate on the amount, and BC said in the wake of this announcement that they hope this is the floor amount and not the ceiling, because they want to pressure Ottawa to raise it in the, I guess, years ahead on this pilot project. Let's jump into the next topic here, and that is the end of the spring legislative session. 5 months long. I would not call it an eventful legislative agenda. 22 bills, things like a cooling off period in real estate, a race-based data collection law, some forestry and First Nations legislation. There was a lot of political dynamics here, though, at play. We saw BC Liberal leader Kevin Falcon arrive into the House. We saw the government introduce the Royal BC Museum project, which created an enormous backlash. And I think for the first time, we saw a lot of issues start to stick on this government about record high inflation, record high gas prices, record high housing prices, all the healthcare system, emergency room closures. I certainly think the government was on the defensive as the session ended. What stood out to you, Jillian, about the session, and how do you kind of view it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, government, it takes a really long time to draft legislation. So government is preparing for a session many, many months, even a year ahead of when it actually happens. So I think that's sort of why you saw the government's agenda and tone be quite out of step with where the public mood was at, because there's been a big shift coming out of, the ending of COVID restrictions, all of these other big issues sort of coming to the surface that you mentioned. And then I think also, of course, with Kevin Falcon arriving back in the House, there had almost been sort of like a holiday from intense politics, both because of, being in the public health crisis of COVID and because we had an interim leader of the BC Liberals who was really kind of just focused on keeping the caucus together, doing good work, and sort of just keeping things stable until Falcon arrived. And then we saw Falcon arrive at the Monday after the Friday that the Royal BC Museum hit. And, you probably couldn't choreograph better timing for the Liberals to sort of come in with all of this new energy and really hit the ground running as opposition. So I think you're right. We saw a huge tone shift sort of, I think, in the provincial media landscape or political landscape. And I think that's sort of, what stood out to me. And it's a session that's going to sort of mark, I think, like a vibe shift in halfway through this mandate.
The point Jillian just made about it being the government slightly out of step, Katy, I think is an interesting one, because the Liberals were able to capitalize that and turn it into being tone deaf. It felt like the legislative agenda, it felt like the speaking points, it felt like the priorities and focus were out of line with the pressures people were feeling, and that gave a lot of room for the opposition to jump in and make some really hard punches that I think landed.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was the worst session for the NDP since they took office, and I think it was the best one for the BC Liberals, which happily coincided with Kevin's entrance into the legislature. But no one should be popping any champagne bottles just yet. There's a lot of work to do before the next election, whether that's next year or 2 years from now. If I was giving advice to the BC Liberals, like they've got 3 priorities. Number 1, they got to prepare for an early election next spring. Number 2, they need to continue with their rebranding process and start bringing folks back into the tent on the Conservative and the Liberal side. And third, like Kevin's got to get out across the province and talk directly to voters. I think that the barbecue circuit will be of an incredible importance this summer. And also, Ford won a commanding majority last night, second term. And I actually think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from Ford's campaign for the BC Liberals in terms of tone, approach, strategy. One of the things that the Ford campaign did in this election is he did less media. It's not like he did no media, but he did less and focused more on getting his message out directly to voters. And I think that works really well for center-right parties who may not have the friendliest audience in mainstream media. Ben Woodfiden, actually, he wrote a piece in the National Post yesterday, and he talks about this like kind of reshaping of center-right politics and how Conservatives are now really aligning with workers who were previously in more of the NDP camp. And I think that this is a perfect lesson for the BC Liberals to take in terms of who are the demographics they should be going after in the next election, which I think will be sooner than we all expect.
What's your advice for the NDP?
Well, I don't necessarily have advice. It's more of a prediction. I've thought this for a long time. I think that Horgan, he's reaching his 5-year anniversary this summer. I know that he's has a leadership role with Council of the Federation. I think Horgan has a real opportunity to leave his post as premier with his head held high and his legacy and reputation intact, museum debacle aside. And so that's a rarity. And so my prediction has always been that he will step down after those duties are complete. And then the NDP will be in a short leadership race. They'll have a new leader next year. They will have a goodies-filled election budget, and then we'll go to the polls.
Yeah, it's certainly a timetable that makes a lot of sense. It also, and not to be cynical and adding this date in, but around that time next year is when members who were elected in the 2017 election get their full pension. And that's always an important point for MLAs when you're talking about moving into a snap election with no security. So you're right, there's a calendar there where we could be in an election early next spring. Jillian, the issue of John Horgan, I thought this was his weakest session since 2017. He had health issues. He obviously battled throat cancer successfully in January. He had COVID in April. He appeared tired, and he admitted that publicly. He dropped an F-bomb on the floor of the House at one point. I watched him in Estimates with Kevin Falcon, and he seemed to have, for lack of a better term, a bit of governmentitis, being kind of focused on talking about, well, the crime rate internally in government is down, while crime to everyone else appears up, and he's arguing about Statistics Canada numbers on healthcare when emergency rooms are closing. What do you make, A, of where his performance recently, and B, if you think he might hang up his cape? Premiers don't have capes, but for lack of a better term, they should have capes.
We don't know
Premiers
that
should
for
have
sure.
Capes, this summer.
Yeah, I think it did seem like maybe like the energy was a little bit different coming from the premier, but I think that it's a quandary for any leader or governing party when they get, you know, this far into having been in government, because they have to run on their record, right? And they have to talk about all of the good things that they did, but that sometimes that can sound out of touch when people are sort of wondering, you know, what you've done for them lately, and you've already kind of expended all of your good ideas, or your biggest good ideas, perhaps. I don't know. I think with the museum, I think that, you know, thinking about it more in the last week after our show, I wondered if that was sort of like he wanted that to be kind of his local legacy. He said often that it reminds us that it's rare to have a premier from the island. And, you know, I think that the government and the premier were shocked with how that went over. And I think it could go either way. I think it could make him sort of double down and really want to see it through and sort of like not leave on that note, having made that decision and take responsibility for it. Or it could be kind of, you know, another thing that makes him feel like maybe he's sort of just done dealing with all of the pressure and the backlash about all of these things. So I don't know. It's going to be really interesting to watch. I don't know if I'm not a betting person, so I wouldn't put money on it either way, but I think it would be hard to.
Katie, back to you. We just have a minute left. If Horgan does double down, stick around because of the museum project, he's also the NDP's biggest asset, so it helps the NDP, but at the same time, like, what are the pros and cons of him choosing not to leave, do you think?
Mm-hmm. Pros, as you said, he has been a tremendous asset to the NDP brand. He has also kept the coalition on the left together. Cons, I think he is potentially compromising his legacy. Longest serving NDP premier, record high popularity, got BC through COVID. If he doesn't step down, then the museum might lag on that record. And I think that would be unfortunate for him personally.
Yeah, step down, or you get dragged down, or you drag it with you and make the museum an election issue and you win, and then everyone says, great, you know. It's who knows? Only one person knows. It's John Horgan. We're all speculating on his future, but we expect some type of announcement of some sort this summer. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thanks to the panel for being here. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and we'll be with you next week here on Political Capital.